Have you ever really thought about the woman in the gospel who had years of bleeding continually? Can you imagine what her life would have been like? She was probably constantly low energy. It probably felt so unfair that this was happening to her. She tried everything and nothing seemed to work. Can you imagine feeling like that? Maybe if you've gone through a long season of hardship, you can imagine what that would be like. Exhausting, discouraging, lonely only begin to describe seasons like this. In this episode of the Christian Marriage Podcast, I talked to a couple who went through their own season of extended hardship with their son battling mental illness. It's a real up and down story, but we talk about how they, like the woman in the Gospels, found enough strength and enough hope to walk toward Christ, knowing that He is the light, He brings healing. Hi, I'm Nick. And this is the Christian Marriage Podcast, the only podcast on the entire internet that talks about Christian marriage that I host. I'm so glad that you're here, and let me just introduce you to Linda and Phil. They are from Roseville, California. They have been married 32 years, and something interesting about them is that they broke up multiple times before marriage, but they actually found that to be a boon in the end because they kept breaking up because they were so different. But then whenever they got married, they had already figured a lot of that stuff out. Here are some principles. There's 3 principles that really stood out to me in our conversation about making it through a season of extended hardship, of extended discouragement so that you can take them away in your life. Number 1 is the importance of encouragement. There is a very underrated and sneaky danger in seasons of long hardship, and it is discouragement. Whether you feel discouraged by your spouse or you and your spouse are going through something hard together, you need things that encourage you. Linda and Phil found encouragement in at least 3 ways that we'll talk about in this conversation. 1, a personal and intimate relationship with God that they pursued through personal prayer and Bible study. It's kind of cliche, but they came back to it, and others on my podcast have come back to it as well as something that was practically very helpful. Secondly, because they were able to find encouragement from God personally, they were able to become a source of encouragement for each other. If you and your spouse are going through something hard, discouraging, especially for a long time, you must become an encourager of your spouse. They need it. And thirdly, they found encouragement through a circle of friends who knew them and who could pray for them and support them closely. Okay, the second principle that stood out from our conversation was that in the middle of a decade plus of heavy, confusing, heartbreaking trouble with their son, Linda and Phil found it very practically helpful to be actively serving and seeking to serve other people. Linda even said, ministering to others ministered to me. It makes me think of the boy who brought Jesus the loaves of bread and the fish right before Jesus fed the 5,000. Even if it feels like we don't have very much to give, God can do amazing things when we pour out what we do have. He can do amazing things for other people, but he can do amazing things in us as well. And the last principle that sticks out, Phil and Linda walked through hardship for at least 10 years. They said that sometimes they couldn't even see the light at the end of the tunnel, or maybe was losing hope that there would be any light at the end of the tunnel. But Phil said that even during this time, this thought helped him. The light at the end of the tunnel was nothing in their circumstances, but it was that God loves me and is in control. When you're in the middle of hard circumstances, that can be a very trite thing for someone to tell you. It goes from being something trite to something that is nothing short of a lifeline at exactly the point where you choose to believe it, just like Phil and Linda did. So I really think you're going to find this encouraging. And like I said, the story itself is such an up and down roller coaster. I think you're going to find it interesting and encouraging. Here's two more things right before we jump in. Here's a question I have for you. If you have gone through hard and long times of suffering, hardship, discouragement, whatever it may be, what were some of the lifelines that you had during that time? Or maybe if you are going through a long period of discouragement, hardship right now, what is one thing that is encouraging to you, even in the middle of everything else that feels discouraging right now? If you have an answer to that question, write it in the comments, because there are other people who do not have an answer to that question, and they might be looking for an answer like yours. The other thing that I have to ask you, if you are finding this episode helpful and encouraging, will you please leave me a 5-star review on the platform that you are listening on? It really helps me to help others. So I'm really excited to bring you my conversation with Linda and Phil. Enjoy. Linda and Phil, thank you for joining me on the Christian Marriage Podcast. I am really excited to talk to you guys. We've been talking a little bit, before we hit recorded, and you guys have already been a lot of fun to just hang out with and get to know a little bit. So I'm looking forward to talking about some things, even some things that are hard, but you have already been lovely to get to know. And so thanks for being here.
You're welcome.
Our pleasure.
So you chose to talk about the journey that you have been on in raising your son and him making some decisions that, well, we'll get into it. Parenting is incredibly difficult, and I've heard people say that bearing children is like taking out your heart and just letting it like walk around out in the world, and it's like who knows what's going to happen to it. And so I have a 2-year-old and a 3-year-old, and that's roughly they're not even getting into very much yet, but I can already feel that kind of thing. So before we dive straight in, if there is a main point to the story that we're going to tell about your marriage and about your son, what do you think it would be? If you could boil it down, what would a main point be for someone who is struggling with decisions that their kids are making?
Just say.
I would say trust God. God is still there. I once heard a pastor say, when you're at the end of your rope, you're at the beginning of God's hope. And And I kind of hang on to that.
I think I would say, um, we often enter into marriage and family with a lot of expectations. Um, and I've also heard it said that, if you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans, right?
Yeah.
And it's the idea that we come into it with a lot of expectations, but that God is still in control, even when our expectations aren't met, even when things don't go the way that we expect that they will. God is still good. God is still loving us. God is still present. That God hasn't changed, and we can still trust Him, as Phil said.
Mm-hmm.
Right. God is still good. And whenever we don't have anything else, we have to trust
Yeah.
God. Like I love that when you're at the end of your rope, you're at the start of God's hope. Um, he he has us, even when it feels like he might not, right?
Yes.
Thanks for that. So, okay. What exactly are we talking about? So we're talking about your son, kind of your relationship, and especially navigating everything that happened with your son, Jeremy. So what happened? Give us an overview.
Well,
It's a lot, but do you want to start?
sure, I'll start. Jeremy was always a challenging child, strong-willed child. Um, in high school, he started really acting out, started getting into trouble, started doing drugs, not really addicted to drugs, but doing drugs. And finally, his senior year, through a series of events, he was diagnosed as being bipolar.
Yeah.
And so some of, not all the drug use was actually mostly him self-medicating himself.
Okay.
Um, so, but bipolar is just messy. And so it was very, very difficult with him. It was very difficult on us. There were times when he would be good, but most of the time he would be bad to horrendous. Uh, and times where he would just scream and shout at us, tell us how much he hated us, tell us how awful we were.
Yeah.
Um,
Which is not a totally unusual thing for a teenager in general,
Sure.
but with bipolar, it was so chaotic. It was kind of more like people living with an alcoholic, where you never knew when you're going to walk in the room, like which Jeremy are we going to have? Is he going to be
Yeah.
explosive? Is he going to be, just totally depressed, or is anything going to set him off? And so we're always kind of walking on eggshells. You never knew what was going to happen. And that was very exhausting for us and very traumatic for us and for his older brother too. And so it was the whole family, the whole dynamic revolved often around what was going on with Jeremy at that given moment.
so
Yeah.
yeah, he couldn't hold down a job for long.
He barely graduated high school. I mean, barely, barely. And then he flunked out of college. He couldn't persist there. So it was rough. It was really rough.
Yeah.
Treatments, medications would work for a while, and then they wouldn't.
And we did all the things. We took him to lots of different counselors. We actually had him in counseling from the time he was in junior high. So it's like not like we just started having problems when he was in high school. It's like we'd been in counseling, as with the family, with by himself. We'd take him to different doctors. It just took that long for them to diagnose what the issue was.
Right.
And then some things would work a little bit, some things wouldn't.
But then we'll speed it up to 24. He's 24. We actually, through some friends in that, he got some treatment that actually was helping and making a difference. His behavior was the best it had been. In years, it was, as he would put it, was the first he could remember smiling. It's not true, but in his memory,
Wow.
it was the first he could remember smiling. But
Wow.
then, shortly after that, he started becoming delusional, where he believed he was traveling to other dimensions, him going back in time and going forward. Believed he had dinner with Jesus and Buddha. All it was crazy, crazy. But so we had dinner with a friend of ours who was a psychiatrist, asking her some advice of what we can do, how we could actually work with his psychiatrist and what we're allowed to say and not say, all those kinds of things.
Yeah.
Had a good dinner, got some good ideas. Driving home from dinner, we got a call from the coroner. They had found our son dead. They found him dead in his car alongside of a road in an area that we don't know that he's ever been to before.
About 40 minutes from home.
Yeah. And it took the coroner 6 months to even come up with the cause of death, and the best they could come up with was he had too much of one of his bipolar meds in his system.
But we were told that shouldn't have caused his death. So they basically it was never resolved. It was a questionable cause of death. So he wasn't suicidal that morning. We had seen him suicidal many times in his life, so we knew at that point he was actually pretty alert and in a bit positive mood that morning. And so something happened. We don't know what happened. We'll never know. We'll never know, and we have to live with that. But we lost him suddenly and unexpectedly, and that was a year and a half ago. So it was June of 2023, and he was 24 years old at the time.
And right whenever he was kind of starting to turn some kind of corner, I think is what you're saying, right?
He was actually the one thing that gave us some hope. This is a big thing. Even in the midst of some of the psychosis and and he was having some improvement. There was all that going on. There was about 4 weeks before he died, one of our second cousins, who is also a psychiatrist, had spending time with him, invited him to his home out on the East Coast, and he'd spent time with him, and he led him back to faith. And Jeremy, I believe it was a genuine expression for Jeremy that he actually had found his way back to God. And we didn't get we've been praying for that for years. He was the prodigal in every way you can think of a prodigal kid. And we've been praying for him. Other people have been praying for him for many years. And when that happened, it was nothing short of miraculous. It always is when someone comes to faith, but this was, I did just kind of almost wondered if it would ever happen. And so after he died, we didn't get a lot of time to celebrate that decision with him. But it gave us, and has continued to give us, a lot of comfort to know that we know where he is, and that he, even though he was alone in his car on the side of a road, that God was right there with him. And so
incredibly comforting. I mean, I have no idea how you deal with that kind of thing, but I have to imagine that experience of just those 3 weeks have to be something that you really cling to. I imagine. I don't know what that's like for you.
Yeah.
Yes, we definitely do.
Definitely.
And we're forever grateful to that. Our second cousin.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. What a gift. There's a whole story behind that. We don't have time to tell about how God helped us reconnect with him the year before. And he was part of helping us get the treatment for Jeremy that was working. And so there were so many points along the way that it's clear God was at work. God was coordinating and orchestrating, and it wasn't just a coincidence. These were God incidences, God in ways, and just reminding us how much God loves Jeremy more than we ever could, and that God was ultimately his, that we had to let go of that. Like, he's not our possession to hold on to, or our child. He's God's, and God was pursuing him.
Yeah, that feels like a very important thing that you just said, that Jeremy belongs to God.
Yeah.
And that God loves him actually more than you guys could. Yes. And so, I'm so sorry for your loss, and it's just the epitome of bittersweet timing. I can't even imagine, but you are here, you're living a life. So what I want to do is I want to talk about some of what held you all together through these years of really kind of, you said, I had almost given up. I wondered if it was ever going to happen. What was our rest of our lives going to look like? I'm sure all of those things you felt them at some point, right?
Yeah.
Oh,
so I'm so glad that we can even talk about those hard times, knowing that there is that hope coming, even as we tell that story, because obviously not everybody has that
Right.
nice kind of, not everybody has that sweet part of it.
It's true.
So I want to just recognize that fact that,
Yep.
that could change, that could change everything.
Yeah.
But you didn't know it at the time. So what was the hardest part of relationally trying to live out your faith, trying to be married, going through this with Jeremy?
It never threatened our marriage.
No,
It just,
it didn't.
it strained it, only because we were just emotionally strained and strained. But it's, the thing that unites us the most, that joins us the most, is our shared faith in God. The thing we most admire about each other, I think, is our faith. Thing I most admire about Linda is her faith, strong faith in God, real faith in God, and vice versa. So there was that anchor, there was that solid foundation that held us together. And then there was never a question of our love for each other. And I don't know, some people might take this the wrong way, but our relationship was more important than even our relationship with our kids. It was like, we're not going to let Jeremy be a wedge between us.
Which was hard at times. I mean, because,
I was going to say, it wasn't like he didn't try.
yeah, he did. And because also he knew how to play each of us. Like he knew how kids do that. And
the buttons, yeah.
Yeah. And so he could, if he didn't get the answer he wanted from one, he'd go to the other, or he'd, push buttons. Yeah. But
never was it going to be, okay, you're going to win over Linda.
Right.
It was never vice versa. So that kind of helped us have a united front.
I would also back up and say, before we started having all the heavy challenges with him, I mean, we had years of it building and building, but I think what kept us together in the heat of it during there was like 10 years, the last 10 years of his life, from the time he was 14 to 24, I would say were the hardest. And that's a long season.
Yeah.
But we had been married for, a couple decades before that. And we have been pouring into our marriage for a lot of years. And so I would say it's all the things that we've done proactively to honor each other, to have fun together, to just to build up our relationship, that then when the storm came and lasted way longer than we ever could have imagined, we had a real strong foundation to build from and draw from.
Yeah. I tell people, you build your marriage, build your faith on the good times.
Yes.
Because in hard times, it's really hard to do that.
You can't figure out how to do it in the moment. It's if you don't have enough.
You want to build it so it's there to draw from.
Yeah.
In the hard times.
So we did draw from all the years of things that we've been through. Every marriage goes through ups and downs, and whatever life happens to you. So those are just opportunities to figure out, how do I trust God in this? How do I grow? Yeah. How do I show love to my spouse when I'm maybe really angry at them or hurt by them or whatever? It's like, those are all moments to build. And thank God for that, honestly, because I don't know that our marriage would have survived otherwise, because it was brutal. We were traumatized, really.
And there were times we just had to lift each other up, after your kid has screamed at you how much they hate you, it just
for an hour or more. Yeah. I mean,
you feel terrible. You just feel awful. And you got, we pick each other up in those moments.
I'm sure that just stabs you in places you didn't know you had. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the crazy thing, I said that he came back to faith. For those 10 years, one of his favorite ways to attack us was to attack our faith. And, we've both been in ministry our whole married life. And so we found it was not safe to talk openly with him around about faith things and ministry things we were involved with. Like, we had to be careful and do that, because it always turned into an argument. It turned into we couldn't have a calm dinner table, any of those things that you hope for. And
Yeah, he even went as far as say, you know, if you love God, you can't love me.
yeah, he said that. So basically, you got to choose God or me.
Okay, it's God.
Now, but it was like back then. I'm
Sure.
like, well, he really,
Terrifying.
yeah. I'm like, how do I even talk to you? If,
Yeah, absolutely. Oh my gosh.
You just had it.
Um,
Yeah, we love you, but we're not giving up on God.
right. You mentioned that, well, a couple things stick out there. Build your marriage, build your faith in the good times, because it's really hard to do that when,
yeah,
you know, the bad times come. And that sticks out as just kind of really practical, difficult to do, I imagine, for a lot. I think so I'm a marriage coach. I kind of typically, people want marriage coaching when things are bad. So I typically see people whenever things are bad. It's difficult. It's difficult to build a faith or cling to a faith that kind of you've been neglecting or hasn't been the priority. So I've certainly seen that. How would you say? I mean, practically, okay. I don't know. I like to kind of push people a little bit to try and define, what does it mean that your faith anchored you two together? What was what do you think the difference was that you shared this strong faith that you really respected in each other? What was practically, what did that mean that it anchored you two together? What do you think? What comes to mind?
Good question.
it's a really good. So like, there's so many little things just throughout the day that
It's really hard to put in words, but it's that sense that and faith is like, it's that certainty. God is with me. God is in me. God is with Linda. God is in Linda, and knowing the same God is in both of us. Just when you're kind of settled on that, then you're settled. You know, you're settled on that, and there's not a question. It's just a sense of certainty.
And I'm thinking you're looking for some practical tips here. I will tell you one thing that did not work for us. That early in our marriage, we hear people talk about you should have devotions together as a couple, right? Well,
okay.
Is an introvert and I'm an extrovert, and the way that we are relationally is just different. And we learned how to navigate that in our marriage, and it's made our marriage stronger. But in our prayer times, like I'm a journaler, like I need to like talk to God, and then if I sense God saying something to me, I make notes about that and I respond and I put.
Yeah.
Bill likes to just sit quietly and he'll read some scripture or read a devotional. He'll sit and he'll just be quiet and pray for long periods of time. And I'm thinking I would be falling asleep over there on the couch right now if I were doing that. So we learned early on, like the way that we relate to God is different, and it didn't really work for us to do it together. So we have our times with God alone. But then what we do about that later is like as life is happening, just in the midst of life, we're making dinner or we're going for a walk or whatever. We might say, this morning I was kind of sensing God saying this to me, and I can see how it relates to what Jeremy was trying to do yesterday. We process it, a little bit. So we're bringing in things that we're sensing God telling us in our own times with God, together when we're together. And it was challenging. We like to go for morning walks. That's the time when we often would talk the most because we had to be out of the house. We couldn't talk like this in front of Jeremy because it just would cause problems. Sure. But that's a practical thing. I just think like being intentional about, noticing what do you see God up to, and then talking about it together. And that would bring me encouragement. Like you would notice things, or you would kind of sense what God was doing inside of you in the midst of a really hard thing. And that was helpful.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. A couple things sticking out. So first of all, you both are pursuing God relationally and intimately, individually,
right?
And then seeking to encourage each other. It sounds like, or I don't know about seeking, but like encouragement would happen.
Yeah,
you would bring encouragement to each other in the middle of obviously what is a incredibly discouraging series of events and like incredibly discouraging decade,
Yeah.
you were able to encourage each other because you were seeking God, and He was also encouraging you. I mean, so far as what's sticking out to me, yeah.
And Bill's also, he preaches most Sundays at the church. So
I don't think we mentioned I'm a pastor. So.
yeah. And actually years ago, we were co-pastors of church too in our denomination. So we both have kind of, we do a lot of teaching, speaking.
Yeah.
And honestly, like everything that was happening in our lives was like lessons that God was teaching us that we could share with other people. So it's like we were always looking for not only what is God, God, I don't know what you're saying here. Like I'm lost on this, but then there'd be some little lesson, something, you know, like, oh, okay, that's a nugget that, like kind of what you're doing with us right now. Like, oh, that seems like a truth that I need to, you know, we would do that in our own sharing with others. So sometimes not telling the whole story, because while he was alive, we had to really protect him in that way. But the truths of the things that we were learning with him weren't just for us; they were for other people too.
And and I think that also helped is we didn't become just totally self-absorbed or just, you know, we always where we seek to minister to other people. So we're always trying to minister to other people too. So that in a way gave us an outlet. It was a way God was able to work in us and work through us into other people's lives that kept God alive in us and our awareness of God working in us, and even in the midst of difficulty at home. Like I said, we didn't announce to the church that, oh, our son is bipolar and you know, going through these issues, because we didn't ever want it to be where if Jeremy knew, well, the church all knows this, that he would never, ever come to church. We didn't want to create a situation like that. But my staff knew, my leadership team knew, and so we did have a support network of people, our, you know, close friends.
Circles of friends who were praying with and for us and for him. And one of the things I found is I speak a lot of times at women's events, retreats, and different events. And anytime I'd ever bring something from my experience with Jeremy, and sometimes because there were other locations, I could talk a little more freely. But anytime I did that afterwards, I always had multiple women coming up to me telling me, I've got a kid like that too, or I have a niece or a nephew or a sister or brother. Like they have someone in their life who's going through mental health issues, and like, I don't know what to do. And there's nowhere in the church I can talk about this. I don't hear people talking about this.
Yeah.
And so that kind of sort of became part of not an official ministry by any chance, but it was just like God was bringing opportunities for me to minister to others, which also ministered to me. It was like, as I'm giving that away, and for them to be able to tell a little of their story to me. And I think that's the power that I found is telling your story to the right people. You can't just, like, you have to protect your kids, but finding safe people you can tell your story to is a huge thing. And we obviously shared that with each other, but then we could share it with others too.
Yeah, unbelievable. You're saying at least one of the really practical things that was helpful was you were able to continue looking outside of your family, to continue to look outside of, outside for people to help, for people to minister to. This was probably, I'm guessing, the biggest part of your life. Even as you're describing it, you're walking on eggshells, and you just to steal some time together, you have to get out of the house in the morning. Like, it dominates your entire life is the sense that I'm getting. But even then, you did not let it consume your entire life is kind of the feeling that I get. Is that how you would say it?
That would be good. Yeah, that would be good. And there were a lot of times where it was really difficult, impossible. We didn't see a light at the end of the tunnel.
We thought this was the rest of our life, taking care of a mentally ill child, because he can't function. He couldn't finish college. He couldn't hold down a job.
So practically, we didn't see a light at the end of the tunnel. But both Linda and I have taught a course on the problem of suffering at the university level. And we used a book by Tim Keller. One of the big points Tim Keller made that I've always held on to is because I can't explain why that happened, but I know it's not because God doesn't love you,
That's right.
because that's indisputable. That was proven on the cross. And I always thought that was brilliant. I always hung on to that. So, so in applying that to our own situations, like, I don't know why this is going on. I don't know why God allows this to go on in our lives, and I know in so many, many other people's lives. But I know it's not because he doesn't love me, because he's proven that on the cross and over again in my own life. If we take the time just to look back and see how many times God has touched our lives. So that was the light. There wasn't anything physical, anything in the current circumstances we could see. The light was that I still know God loves me and is in control. That's what kept us going.
And I add that, we're telling our story from our perspective, being in ministry, and that's part of how God gave us those things to pour into. So it wasn't just all being consumed with Jeremy, because it's isolating to be a caregiver for someone like that. But I would say this is not just something for people in full-time ministry to be able to do. Like, this is anybody who's got a situation where they have a traumatic issue happening in their family of some kind, or a thing that feels isolating, where I can't talk about this. This doesn't feel safe. All those kind of things. Like, that knowing, like, finding resources, finding the right people, finding a marriage coach, finding, getting into counseling, getting a spiritual director, getting into a small group, like finding places where you can tell your story, you can be prayed for. And that helps. Like, we each did those things in our circles, which then it helped us bring things back to each other. Because it's like, we couldn't just get everything we needed from each other. We had to get it from other places as well, as we're giving out. And so I would just say, for anybody watching this, is like, you might be thinking, oh, well, they're pastors, of course they figured this out. No,
that just reminded me of something. You asked earlier, one of the things we did to keep our marriage strong through all this is every once in a while we went to a marriage and family therapist. We said, we need some help. We need some time to process what's going on. We need someone to help us process what's going on. And we would do basically check-ins with a marriage and family therapist every once in a while. That were really helpful.
Yeah.
I can imagine that with everything. I hope I don't mean to dishonor anybody, but there was a lot of chaos going on around your, just in your house. I don't know. And if my house, if my 2 or 3 year old, they create certain kinds of chaos, it's hard. It can be hard for me and my wife to just stay connected when we're dealing with all of the chaos for a couple days in a row. So I imagine that it was really hard to actually push towards each other and stay connected with all of this chaos going on for 10 years.
Yeah. And we're looking back now and telling you the ways what helped us, but in the moment to moment, there were times when we really, we
were just figuring it out as we went.
It was dark night of the soul. It was, like in the depths, like this was, truly, truly hard. And so, we look back and we can see blessings, and even at the time going through it, we could see blessings, but it was heavy.
Yeah.
So not, and when kids are little, when our boys were little, because they were close in age, like yours are, there's chaos. And so, like, that's a good time to figure out how to navigate chaos. Then you get to be teenagers, and there's different kind of chaos. And then if you have any issues like what we did, that just adds more. But
yeah. God prepares you for what you can handle in the moment, right? Like, all I can do is deal with, Legos all over the floor. That's all I can. I'm
and the challenge in the middle of the night. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, right. That's good. So you had already kind of mentioned this, but I wanted to just dive a little bit more into it. So you said what you would tell someone, the main point is that you can trust God. What was it? What were there any particular truths? You've mentioned, like, God is good. Were there any particular scriptures or truths or anything else that, like, helped ground you and encourage you, specifically through these tough years?
I had one like right towards the early teen years for Jeremy that that's still to this day, like it was really one of those moments when you kind of like, I didn't hear an audible voice, but I really sensed God saying something to me. I was just at that time, he was starting to act out a lot, but we didn't understand all the mental health issues completely. And I just thought, God, we're trying this, we're doing all these things. Like, why? Am I a bad parent? Like, what's wrong with us? Why is he not, why can't we figure this out? And
Yes.
and in that moment, I felt like God said to me, well, remember my first children and what they did? And it was like, and I felt like God was saying, do you think you're a better parent than I am? What? So it was the idea that even in paradise, Adam and Eve chose to rebel and walk away from God. So what makes me think that I can control another human being completely? I cannot do that,
Wow.
And so learning that gave me a lot of freedom and grace to say, God is the ultimate loving parent. He had his first children in paradise and they rebelled. So I need to have grace on myself, keep seeking God, keep trying to do all the best I can, but change my expectations here. I cannot, manipulate my own miracles and design my own deliverance. I can't,
Yes.
I can't put Jeremy in a box. So that's one that stayed with me a long time.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, that God's people have always been a mess. I mean, Adam and Eve, the people of Israel, the church, like, so that's I love that. When it's always been helpful to me to look at the ways that God has loved me, that He is kind of calling me, that He might be calling me to love someone else, and to say, look, I have led the way in this, and you don't, because whenever you're going through it, it just feels you've never experienced this kind of stuff before. It feels like you're like blazing new trails or something, but that's never the case, because God has always kind of gone before us in the way that He's calling us to love someone else. And I feel like that's generally kind of what you're saying. Yeah.
I mean, God basically had taught us what radical unconditional love is in a way that I don't think we ever could have imagined. I don't know. What do you think about that?
No, I agree. And also, we're not in control. You try to guide your children and direct your children, but there's an age, and especially as they're getting their teenager, you create as many boundaries as you can and give as much guidance as you can. But in the end, you're not in control.
Wow. Yeah, you're not in control. That's a tough one.
God actually kind of led me to a prayer posture. When we talk about, like, when we say as a group, like, let's pray, and we all think we hold our hands and bow our head and close our eyes. That's what we do. And God started inviting me to pray like this. And I actually have a sculpture on my desk that's two hands that are open like this. So over the last 10, 12 years, God's been teaching me about open-handed living. And I've used that idea a lot in a lot of retreats I lead and teaching I do because I needed it. Like, God was teaching me, but the idea that if I'm grasping and I'm trying to control things, then my hands are closed and I can't receive good things God might want to give me. And so if my hands are open, then it's like, God, I'll receive the good gifts you give me. And then if you choose to take them away, that's your choice. And I'm not going to try to grasp and control it. And that was especially important as Jeremy became suicidal. I finally kept trying to keep him alive, just keep him alive. And we got to a point where we realized we cannot watch him 24/7. We cannot do, if he chooses to end his life at some point, we can't even control that. And so I had to just say, God, he's yours, and my hands are open, and I trust that you're looking out for him more than I am, and I will live open-handedly before you and not grasp and cling to things to make it be the way I think it should be,
Right. You talked before about how would you even put this into words, this kind of, this sort of experience. I mean, heartbreaking doesn't really do it. It's cliche at this point, but how would you describe it? How would you describe the kind of heartbreak and just hurt that this felt like?
And it was different. That was one of the things when Jeremy died. The grief was different for each of us.
Yeah.
And I think that's helpful to let people know it's people grieve in different ways. And so we allowed each other to grieve differently. So for myself, it was this sense of being like a blank, and a numbness, not sort of like numb to the feelings where I'm trying to push them off, but I just felt I was just a lump.
And you also had a lot of headaches.
Yeah, a lot of headaches, a lot of noise in my head.
Yeah.
But I would just sit on the couch. I couldn't even watch TV. I would just sit on the couch, just a lump, numb. Just I don't know. It's hard to describe. But that was.
There was just kind of the feeling that I'm getting in what you're describing is like there was just this kind of overwhelmed emptiness type of like I have nothing. I'm drained.
Yeah, deep sadness. Yeah, I don't have words for it, but the church was gracious and just gave me as much time as I needed, which was really, really helpful because I realized I just need to be this way. I just need to, in a sense, be a lump and not try to fight it because fighting would only delay it. Delay the recovery.
Fighting would only delay it. Yeah.
Wow. And my way of grieving is just, tears. Tears are, the thing. And I spent a lot of hours and days sobbing, just sobbing and sobbing and sobbing, just endlessly. For months, this went on, and it was horrible. It was horrible. But I also realized like I needed to express it. And it wasn't like I was just sitting alone crying. It was honestly the times I cried the most were when I was just having a quiet time with God. It was like that was where like all my emotions would just come out, and I just and I felt like I was being held by God, and that I just needed to express what I was feeling. And so Phil let me have space to be weepy a lot, and I gave him space to just not have to use words a lot, but just to be kind of quiet. And so that whole first year after we lost him was just really rough. It's been a year and a half now. I would say we're kind of, it does get better in time. The grief never goes away. You just learn how to live with it. And so there's still times when it pops up in unexpected places, things that remind you of something or whatever. And all of a sudden, I can feel my eyes stinging. Like I know I'm going to cry because this is like this. It's just catching me in this moment. But that's also healing too, because like, I don't want to forget him. And we're talking about all the hard things about Jeremy. There were things we loved about Jeremy too. And I think also when you give more of yourself and love and express love, there is more of a loss. There's like, you really love them because there's a hole that's there, even when it was a hard time being with them. You would think we would just feel relief in some ways. And certainly there's parts of our lives that are easier that we don't have him in it, but there's still sadness because we miss him.
So when I was sharing with my church for Advent season, we did the classic themes of hope and peace and joy and love. And talking about peace, when Jeremy died, there was a song on the radio, Christian song, that went, "Everything's going to be all right. Everything's going to be all right." And my head would and that was going through my head. I would hear the song would be going through my head, and my brain would just scream, "Everything is not all right." And I told my congregation, I said, "Everything will never be all right. Jeremy's gone. He's dead. Everything will never be all right. It's not going to be all right, but I'll be all right." And that's peace. And maybe that's my takeaway from it all is that it's not all right. It's not ever going to be all right, but I'll be all right because God is still with me, and I know it.
And a couple weeks ago, we got to team preach on the Sunday about joy. And I shared about how decorating for Christmas this year, like I didn't even want to decorate last year. It was a struggle to celebrate our first Christmas without him. But this year, I thought, we had moved to a new place and felt like a fresh start. And I wanted to kind of recover some of my joy in decorating. I found I usually decorate the week of Thanksgiving, and I'd taken the week off work, and I found that everything I unwrapped, every time I unwrapped an ornament, it's like it had a new memory of a family thing that happened, or a time we traveled somewhere, or a time the boys made, handmade ornaments. And so the whole thing was actually, it was like so emotional. I was just like grieving heavy that week.
Yeah.
But in the midst of that, I also felt like God was inviting me, like, these are good memories. Like, you can hold on to these. There's tragedy and there's sorrow, but there's also joy in remembering the gifts that God has given. And so it's like, I wasn't trying to, be Pollyanna and just wipe, I was feeling what I was feeling, but I was also genuinely in the midst of that feeling the joy that I know what the season is about. And I know, I love my kids, and I love that, all the things they can remember about that. And so that's helpful too, for us to share those, memories.
Yeah,
Definitely.
Jeremy.
To have, and to just be able to live in like both of those things.
Yeah.
The heaviness and sadness and the heartbreak, and also the joy and the goodness and smiles, and just the good things about time together. To just be able to say these are both true.
And I would say that, for people who are having challenges in their marriage, that's true. Like, at times, maybe when your marriage is really hard, that's not the only truth about your marriage. There's also things there that you've built on, that there's love, there's joy, there's happy memories. Like, those things can also be there in the midst of the hard stuff. And it's not ignoring those things, but it's saying that's not all of what we have. We have more than that,
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. No, that's helpful. Linda and Phil, it's been a real joy to talk about some really hard things. I'm sure we could talk more about so many other things. How do you even talk about a life lived, much less a family's life lived, right? But thank you for sharing your story in this, and I'm encouraged, even as I'm kind of I'm kind of actually living in both of those feelings right now, like such unbelievable heaviness and hope eternal, and it can be confusing even now, even with me just hearing you guys talk about it from your perspective. So I can't imagine what it was like for you, but both of those things completely exist. So thank you for sharing your experience and your story with Jeremy.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thanks for inviting us.